I am delighted to be hosting today's conversation with Tom Falk from Kimberly Clark, but I'm actually going to begin by telling you a story. And I'm going to promise you two things. One, it is relevant, and two, it is absolutely true. A couple of years ago, at my mother's 100th birthday, you heard that right, her 7 grandchildren were around a table and talking about, oh my heavens, think how the world has changed since she was born in a tiny little village in Kansas in 1912. And then they tried to imagine what must have been like not to have all the cool stuff. So they had a conversation, what was the coolest thing in that 100 years? Was it cell phones? Was it airplane travel? Was it television? And she finally came over and sat at the table, and they said, Grandma, in your life, what is the greatest invention? And she thought for a while and looked at them all and said, the Kleenex and the Kotex. This is a true story. And I mention it not simply because it's the products of Kimberly Clark, but also because I think it embodies the mission of your organization, Tom, which is to improve essentials for a better life. Improve essentials for a better life. It's basic, it's simple, it matters. And 1/4 of the population of the globe every day buys a Kimberly Clark product. So, Tom, you became chair about 10 years ago of an organization that had been around for, I think, something like 140 years, and you were only its 8th CEO. You have spent most of your career at Kimberly Clark, and as we were talking, I found it fascinating that you started out by talking about why entering through internal audit is absolutely the best place in so many ways to get a good understanding of the organization, and then you got to move all through and run divisions, be responsible for global strategy, run operations, until finally you became the CEO. And I am particularly pleased at the award that you were in New York to receive yesterday, because you won the Catalyst Award for organizations that promote women in management and leadership and on their boards of directors. It is an extraordinary honor. So please join me in welcoming the man who runs the company that is responsible for the 2 greatest inventions of the 20th century, Tom Falk.
Well, thank you, Faye. That's a fantastic story, and I'll tell you the rest of the Kleenex and Kotex story in a minute. I thought I'd talk a little bit about who Kimberly Clark was, but usually what I'll do with a group like this is just simply ask for a show of hands, who has ever worn a diaper here? Come on, somebody, somewhere in your past, you wore a diaper. Come on, work with me a little bit. I know some of you guys are holding back. Maybe you were potty trained from birth, I don't know, but so now you understand part of our business in addition to Kleenex and Kotex. But we're about a $21 billion company. We were founded in 1872. It's 142 years ago. Today we sell to about 1/4 of the world's population. Every day about 1.3 or 1.4 billion people use our products somewhere in the world. Now the good news is there's still 3/4 left to go. So we've got huge growth opportunity. We'll talk about emerging markets in a minute. We created 5 of the 8 categories that we operate in today, including Kleenex and Kotex. And we'll talk a little bit about that. We sell our products today in more than 175 countries around the world. So we're global. A little over half our sales are outside the U.S. We've got number 1 or number 2 market positions in about 80 countries. We've got 5 brands that individually sell more than $1 billion of product, and we're organized into 4 key business segments. So I want to talk a little bit about sustainability in the context of our company, but we've celebrated 140 years as a company, and there's not many that can say that. And it's interesting when you reflect on just going back 100 years, what might be the most useful products. But if you go back 140 years, that would be before the invention of the telephone, before the invention of the electric light bulb, and before the invention of the automobile. So if you think about what running a company would be like in those days, not just without our iPhones or BlackBerries, but without television or without lights, without phones, without any of those kinds of things that we take for granted to run a business today. Our first product was newsprint. So we were a paper manufacturer, and so and that was our big business for many, many years. Some interesting or depressing, depending on your point of view, facts would be the average life expectancy today of a Fortune 500 company is 40 or 50 years. So they typically come, go, they get obsoleted by something. In fact, Fortune first started keeping its list in 1955, and since then, of that initial list, 87% of the companies on that initial list are gone, one way or the other. They were merged, they went out of business, something happened to them where they're no longer on the list. So we have been on the list every year since 1955, and there's a very small handful of companies that have been able to do that. Now, if we had stayed in newsprint, I can safely tell you we would no longer be on that list. Something would have happened along the way. Kind of the rest of the story about Kleenex and Kotex, those were our first two consumer brands. They were launched in the 1920s, late 1920s, right after World War II. Our first consumer research was that nurses began using bandage material for feminine care protection during World War I. And they brought that idea back. In those days, whatever feminine care products there were sold behind the pharmacist counter and wrapped in brown paper packaging. There was no consumer market. So we took the step of launching a consumer brand, actually advertising it, and created a category. But the company was conservative. They were headquartered in Neenah, Wisconsin. They were afraid this Kotex thing might screw up the beautiful newsprint business, so they called the company International Cellucotton Products and headquartered in Chicago. And then after a year or so of selling Kotex, the salesman needed something else in their bag, so they thought, well, we can make this cold cream remover out of the same material. We'll call it Kleenex, and then they'll have two things they can go sell to the store. And so Kleenex and Kotex were our first and second consumer products, and they became large and successful. In the 1950s, were merged into the mothership of Kimberly-Clark, and then the rest is history. We entered Huggies in the 70s, and Pull-Ups, Depend, Poise, and a number of other brands that we're proud of. Of course, we merged with Scott in 1995, so picked up all the Scott paper family of brands at that point. So I want to talk about the sustainable enterprise and what our reflection on 140 years mean. And sometimes when we think of the word sustainability, we mean operating in an environmentally friendly way or being somehow a good corporate citizen. And for us, it really means three things. To be sustainable, you've got to deliver consistent growth. You've got to be a good corporate citizen and practice corporate social responsibility. And you've got to have a culture that will carry that forward and will make it right for the next generation. And so when I think about consistent growth, I know that the four founders of Kimberly-Clark, Shattuck, and Babcock, and I have no idea why Shattuck and Babcock never got top billing. I guess they could only fit two names on the door. But I know they wouldn't have predicted where Kimberly-Clark's going to be today. So the companies had to morph and change and adapt over time. Now, the company went public in 1929. Now, that may have been a good idea. They went right before the crash. They survived the crash. But if you bought one share of Kimberly-Clark in those days, which was about $50 on its initial public offering, and you hung on to that through all the splits and with all the dividends, today that share would be worth a little over $500,000, about a 12% compound since 1928. Now, if you put that same amount of money in the S&P 500 in those days, it'd be worth about $100,000. So for those of you that are financial in the room, that's the difference between 9% TSR over 80 years and 12% TSR. The power of compounding drives that significant return. Now, I joined Kimberly-Clark 30 years ago. At that point in time, we were about a $2 billion company. Today, we're a $21 billion company. So we've even transformed in the last 30 years. Our leaders have had to focus on growth in that period of time. When I joined Kimberly-Clark, we had an airline. We had Midwest Express, which we founded that airline, and it wound up getting acquired. We were the world leader in cigarette paper. which, when you're going to be a consumer company, didn't seem like a good idea, so we spun that off in the early 90s. We were actually one of the world's leaders in completion of corporate jet aircraft, so we did all the Canadair Challenger completions in North America. We sold that business to Gulfstream in the 80s. So we've been regularly paring the portfolio. It's a separate question of how we got in those businesses in the first place, but we made money at all of them and made money getting out of them. But I'm proud to be a part of and lead the company. My first day on my very first job, I worked as a CPA for 3 years. I was in the office of the partner who hired us, and he gave us a very simple approach to business that stuck with me through my whole career. And he said, to be successful in business, you got to do 3 things. You got to take care of your customers, you got to find a way to grow, you got to develop people. And if you do those 3 things, you will be successful at whatever you set out to do. And so as I think about my journey at Kimberly-Clark, that's certainly been what we've been all about, and to try and take good care of our customers and make sure we've got the right growth opportunities. So as I look at how we've performed in the last 10 years, we've grew our top line at about 4%. Our bottom line's grown at about 6%. Our TSR has been about an 11% compound, so not quite the 12% since 1928, but pretty close through some exciting markets. We've seen substantial growth in emerging markets. In 2003, emerging markets were about 22% of our sales. Last year, they were almost 40% of our sales. So in China last year, for example, my diaper business grew almost 40%. In Russia, we've been growing strong double digits. In Latin America, we've been growing strong double digits. And so you're still seeing an emerging middle class in those markets that's yet to fully play out. We would guess that just in the next 10 years, 1 billion new middle-class consumers will emerge in just a handful of markets. If you look at China, Russia, Brazil, and the rest of Latin America, that will be 1 billion new consumers. And as I said today, we're only serving 1.3 billion, so we expect to see that double in just the next 10 years. Now, this has been good for our shareholders as well. We talked about the TSR. We've also been a consistent dividend payer, so we've paid a dividend for 80 consecutive years, and we have increased that dividend for 42 consecutive years. And so I really believe that the growth and profitability that the company generates should ultimately benefit the shareholders. So we're continuing to find a way to growing our sales, growing our profits, continue to invest in the business, and making sure our shareholders benefit from that. So that's all good from the business standpoint. We've got a good core business, and we've got great growth options. But what about doing the right things? And how about being a sustainability enterprise? And when you've been around for 140 years, you're kind of sustainable. And we were talking at our table today about farming in Vermont and a short growing season. Well, one of our early operations in the newsprint business involved forestry in Canada. And in northern Ontario, it takes about 100 years to grow a tree to cutting height. In Brazil, it takes about 7 years. So that short growth cycle and cold weather makes a big difference. So back 140 years ago, when our ancestors at Kimberly-Clark started to cut down trees to make newsprint, they planted 2 more. Now, there was no government authority telling them that you had to reforest. There was, the Canadian government wasn't that regulated in those days, but it just seemed like the right thing to do, that if you're going to consume a resource, you should try to find a way to replenish that resource if you can. And so now, more than 100 years later, we are no longer doing any forestry in Canada and haven't for many, many years. And several years ago, I got a wonderful note from the company that is now running that operation, where they're winning forestry awards for the trees that Kimberly-Clark ancestors planted 100 years ago. And so that's a great example of doing the right thing and sustainability, and how sometimes it takes a long time to play out, but it definitely makes a difference. And it's true that you've got to stay true to those values that the company was built on. And 140 years ago, it was built on 3 things of providing quality products, providing great service, and then dealing fairly with your employees and communities. And we're still doing that today, and that works pretty much everywhere around the world. But I think it takes more than that. We make products that are disposable, and so we've got a bigger accountability to try to do more and give back for the environment. And so we set rolling stretch goals 5 years out on what impact do we want to have on the planet. How do we get landfill free from all of our manufacturing plants? How do we consume less water in our processes. And oh, by the way, let's create an equivalent amount of water in the communities where we operate that will provide for people in a water-starved area. How do we actually reduce the total amount of greenhouse gases we produce, not just the greenhouse gas per unit of output? And so we're setting those kinds of goals for every one of our operations around the world, tracking our progress. We're also trying to find new innovative ways to make our products that are better for the environment. We're experimenting with plantation-grown bamboo as a substitute for forests and for other tree-based products, so that we won't have as big of an impact on the carbon shield that the trees provide. And we find that to be incredibly motivating for our employees. Our people really resonate and their engagement builds when they find companies that are doing the right things and giving back to the community. We're also doing things behind our brands to give back in locations around the world. So we've got a program in the U.S. called Every Little Bottom behind our Huggies business, because low-income moms can't always get diapers. And so we've donated more than 100 million diapers to diaper banks and set up the first national diaper bank so that low-income moms can get the products that they need to care for their families. In other markets, the essentials for a better life means something else. So in Africa, we're working on a project called Malaria No More in combination with the Gates Foundation to try to eliminate malaria, which is a leading cause of infant death in that part of the world. We're also working with companies like Unilever. They've created a new organization called the Toilet Board, because you would be shocked at the number of people in the world that have no access to sanitary toilet facilities. And that, in and of itself, is a big problem for lots of things. It causes a lot of disease. It actually causes women to stop going to school. If that school doesn't have a sanitary toilet facility, once the girls reach puberty, they quit going to school. And so all these kinds of simple things that we take for granted don't yet exist in the emerging markets, and we're trying to be part of a solution to not just go there and bring them great products and great brands, but to also bring them the other essentials for a better life along the way that help. On the planet front, we're going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 5% cumulatively. We're doing it in creative ways. It's mostly energy conservation, so we've got energy productivity reviews at all of our facilities. We're also finding ways. We built a little pipeline in South Carolina to move methane gas from a landfill to be burned in a tissue operation that eliminated some bad actors from the environment. And so it's just being creative and bringing innovation to help solve problems that might face the planet. So today we would say that we've brought some level of environmental innovation, whether that be packaging reduction, some newer material, or some other way to recycle, reuse, or respect the environment, to about 40% of our sales. And so that's a big impact, and we're finding customers around the world increasingly resonate with that, both at a consumer level and at a B2B level. Now, mom won't pay more for an environmentally friendly product, but if you can give her a product that works just as well, that's also better for the environment. Consumers are more and more willing to do that. If you look at the culture and the cohesiveness of that, which I think is the ultimate test of any corporation, we absolutely believe that people are the heart of what we do. We were so proud to win the Catalyst Award because, for me, the Catalyst Award wasn't about fairness or equity or giving women a fair shot. It was about having the very best talent. And so as I look at where our workforce is going, if Faye and I were up here picking an all-star team and Faye got to pick her team from the whole room and I only got to pick my team from the left-hand side of the room, she would have a much better team. And so for me, it's about getting the best people on your team, and that's absolutely what's driving us in that area. It's also moving beyond a North American-focused company to a global-focused company. More than half of our sales, more than half of our employees now live outside the U.S. We're finding innovation coming all over the world, and the best ideas traveling very rapidly. If we launch something in this country and wait to read the marketplace and see how it's going to perform, one of our competitors has launched the same idea in 2 or 3 other international markets. So you've got to be very quick to get there before your competitors are going to get there. We're trying to build scale globally while still staying relevant locally. So our business managers in each local country feel like they own the business. It's their profit and loss statement. and there's some global capabilities to help them execute globally. So if you think about what this means for us, I mean, the mark of a sustainable enterprise to me is being flexible and agile, taking a look at your portfolio, continuing to make sure you're in the right businesses, taking care of your customers, continuing to find a way to grow for the future, and then developing the team of people that will take you there. So when you can answer all those questions and do that consistently over time, you will absolutely build a company that can weather the storms over the last 140 years. So I hope you've enjoyed this little path down Kimberly Clark's memory lane, and I'd be happy to pause now and take a few questions from the group. There's some young students with microphones around if there are some questions. Yes?
It sounds as if you're doing all the right things. At 2 or 3 in the morning, what keeps you awake? What are the things you worry about?
Yeah, it's a great question. When I was a newer CEO, I've been CEO for about 12 years now. I used to worry a lot more about the things I couldn't do anything about. And so if you look at this year, for example, I got a nice business in Russia and the Ukraine. I've got a pretty good sized business in Venezuela. I've got a pretty good sized business in Argentina. I've got a lot of things at stake in Turkey and Thailand. And yet I can't do a whole lot about any one of those things except try to make sure our people are protected. So the things I worry about most today are do we have enough innovation coming fast enough? Because we're finding competition, people tend to think about Procter & Gamble as our biggest competitor, but P&G's there, Unicharm is there in Japan, and they're spreading out of Asia. CMPC in South America is very aggressive. So pretty much somebody wants to eat your lunch every day when you get out of bed, and I'm sure you all find the same way. So innovation is one, and then talent is the second. And I think increasingly in this global world, having the very best team and having your people develop quickly enough for the business opportunities is critical. I mean, my business in China today is about $500 million. It'll probably be $1 billion within 3 years. So I've got to be able to have a team that today can run a $500 million business. They better be able to run $1 billion business 3 years from now. I met a young man in China 2 or 3 years ago who was 23 years old and running our Walmart business in Shanghai for us, which is about a $40 million account. And I was talking to him. His name is Patrick, and he was very worried that his career wasn't moving fast enough. And I said, Patrick, I can say with great confidence that there's nowhere else in the world we would let you run a $40 million business at age 23. So I said, you just need to hang on for the ride here. So, other questions? Yes. Yeah, sure. The question was about the Russia and the Ukraine, and as the leader of a big company, what are my thoughts on what's going on? And I'd say if you look at the greater scope of history, Russia has always wanted access to a warm water port to ensure they could get their goods to market in any kind of weather. So there's no accident there's a lot of Russians that live in the Crimea. So we don't like the way that they did it, but if you look over history, it's not completely unpredictable that they did what they did. So having said that, how all the politics works out, I was talking to a couple of big oil guys recently, and they have a lot at stake in that part of the world, certainly much more than we do. And they would guess that this is going to wind up as some kind of status quo where Russia doesn't take any more territory, but they probably don't give up what they've taken either, and everybody just agrees to get mad, but they get over it after a while. So we'll see what happens and move forward from here. Yes?
Could you talk about some of the things you're doing to accelerate the development of those leaders you talked about? You said 3 years they got to be double the size.
Yeah. That's a great question. So the question was, how do you accelerate the development of a team? So you've got to have really built-up HR capabilities. So today, everyone we hire in China, day one has an individual development plan. And then, for those people that are in critical roles, you're finding accelerated development experiences. We've done a lot of of cross-border moves, but doing big expat assignments is really expensive. So we've done some 3-month swaps where we'll have, we had a person in China who was working on a project. That same project needed to be reapplied in Brazil. We sent them on a 3-month assignment to Brazil, where they got a great cross-border experience. We're doing some cross-functional moves where we're giving people a chance to manage in a different function. And so where I'd say years ago you tended to move people to fill vacancies, and if you got some development out of it, that was kind of a nice thing. Today you have to be much more purposeful and actually force moves to create the development so that you've got the people that are ready with the skills that you need. And maybe it doesn't apply that same level to everybody. We've done a better job of identifying what are those critical roles, what's the succession planning for those roles, and for those key, near ready now successors, they've got to have all those right development moves and prioritize those and make them happen and hold the leadership team accountable for that. And so, we set goals every year on number of development moves for top talent and how many of them were cross-functional, how many of them were cross-geography, and start to track that, and then you can start to see the momentum happening over time. Yes, other questions? There's one in the back, yes.
I'll talk loud enough. Can you tell me how you protect the security of your people in places like Crimea and other areas where there are conflagrations going on?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a corporate security team that's staying close to what's going on in any part of the world. So in the Ukraine, for example, we were in constant contact with our team, making sure to find out what they thought they needed. And sometimes it's trying to also figure out, if you watch the CNN version of what's happening, the camera will be right in front of the demonstrators. If they panned out a little wider, you'd see the guys with barbecue grills on the side watching the fun. So sometimes our people will say, "What's the big deal? What are you guys? Why are you getting me up in the middle of the night? There's nothing going on." Now we made sure the guys in the Ukraine all had satellite phones, so if things went down, that we could get them out. And so you try to anticipate as much as you can and get ready for it. At the same time, in the middle of the crisis, we were starting to get emails from some of our young sales reps in the Ukraine talking about what great opportunities they were going to have when this blows over, because some of the competitors were leaving, and there's going to be more opportunity for us. So I think the other lesson is, if you can survive the crisis and set yourself up to have staying power, there is opportunity in these markets. And a long time ago, one of my Kimberly Clark mentors, when I was worried about some crisis in some Latin American country or whatever, he said, "Listen," he said, "people need diapers and bathroom tissue every day, no matter who is in charge." And he said, so just biologically, they need us. And he said, there will be bumps in the road, there will be upsets, there will be issues you have to wrestle with, there will be things that happen to the P&L that you don't like in the short term. But if you can stick it out and build your brand there, you'll eventually be pretty happy with the outcome. And I think that's been pretty good advice over the years. Other questions? There's one over on the side somewhere.
I have heard that one of the most difficult countries to do business in is India. You have not commented on India. There's 1.2 billion people there. What are your experiences in that country?
Yeah, India is a very challenging market. There's very little modern trade there, very few big modern customers. I think there's something like, as last we measured it, more than 800,000 individual selling points. So when we went into India, we did a 50-50 joint venture with Unilever. So they'd been there for 60 years. They'd operated, had a reputation for operating ethically. They had distribution access. They had a network of trucks that traveled the country. They put our products on the back. So we put a little bit of money in our Kotex and Huggies brands into a joint venture. They put a little bit of money in their distribution capability into the joint venture. And so far, it's going well. Now, what I would also tell you, though, is that India is changing, but changing at a bit slower rate than a market like China toward consumerization. So they have a much higher savings rate, and they've been a little bit more traditional in changing their practices. So when I go out into international markets, I always do consumer home visits, where I go to see moms of diaper-age children. I have them bring out all the products they use to care for their babies. They don't know who we work for, so that you find out where they shop, how they get information about their brands, how they care for their children. And so I was in the home of a young Indian mom a couple of years ago, and this was a small apartment she lived in with her husband and their newborn, her husband's parents, and her husband's grandmother. And so this young mom had been told by the grandmother and the mother-in-law that she should not use disposable diapers, that they were unnecessary, it was a waste of money, it would be bad for the baby. And so she decided this was her apartment and she was going to use disposable diapers. But I would say, 4 or 5 years ago, she wouldn't have been able to overcome that generational pressure. And so you're seeing it start to begin to open up. Some categories much faster than others, electronics and things like that, much faster. But in some of the traditional consumer products, that's taken a little bit longer. So our business in India is relatively smaller than it is in China, but there's still a decent growth rate, and it absolutely will be big one day with the 1.2 billion consumers. So it might not be in the next 3-year plan, but maybe in the 3-year plan after that, we'll see India probably on the map. Other questions?
Let me ask a question from over here. So
Sure.
if you have this international tablet to attack, how do you rationalize product development from the Indian model you just described to the Southern California mom that we know is at the cutting edge of everything?
Yeah, what we've tried to do is do research in multiple places. So we've got a lot of innovation capability in the U.S. because that's our heritage. We have an innovation center in Colombia and an innovation center in Seoul, and then we've got sort of small innovation scouts in individual markets to pick up on technology ideas. So a lot of the core material science and R&D gets done in those big centers, but then in market you're looking at adapting and adopting that to the local consumer. And you find consumer preferences are pretty consistent all over the world, but there are some important differences. So for example, in Korea, baby skin health and how the skin looks is much more important to mom than it is in any other market in the world. And so having a breathable outer cover so air circulates so that the baby doesn't get clammy skin is much more important. Now, as it turns out, that is a benefit everywhere else. It's just not as important, so you want to lead with that in Korea. So they may choose to prioritize innovation in that area ahead of other things that might be in the pipeline. And so it's understanding what's different based on research and not on personal opinion. So you'll also find in the consumer world that everybody's got a point of view, and sample size 1 is extremely dangerous. So you've got to be out doing research and then understanding you don't have to test it in 100 countries. Usually there's a half a dozen countries that we know capture the range of differences in the market, and if it tests well in Singapore, it's probably going to work in Malaysia and Vietnam and a few other places. And so it's really building that learning over the years and then applying it. You occasionally continue to check and see what's going on in this digital, mobile, social world. You can do R&D a lot quicker than you used to. We've built virtual communities of consumers online around a similar demographic. So we'd have, a community of 600 young late teen women that we can give ideas to about feminine care products. Now you have to make it interesting enough and have other content and other things in it. You may catch their perspective on other social issues as well. And you recruit them, and you can flash them out an ad idea, a packaging concept, but you also have to mix it in with some other things and have an online conversation. So you gather information in a little different way than we still do focus groups. We just don't do as many of them because you can do this kind of research a lot faster and cheaper. Other questions? All right. Oh, we got one here.
Manage ethics compliance in such a complex world?
Ethics and compliance is a big deal. We've been around for 140 years and built on the quality, service, and fair dealing. And I'm an internal auditor, so I was wired for. I actually understood Sarbanes-Oxley when it first came out and all that kind of stuff. I read the 10K, but many CEOs do. We all have to certify that. Don't misunderstand. But when you go into an individual market, so for example, we were building a plant in Russia. It was very expensive and very time-consuming to get all the permits. So we had a capital budget, we had a project plan, and so I would have the usual project reviews and would say, we're going to be on time, under budget, right? And they would say, yep. And then I would say, and we're going to do it the right way, right? And they would say, yeah. And I'd say, so just tell me again, what's going to happen if you're going to miss the schedule, you're going to go over budget? What are you going to do? And the answer is we're not going to pay anybody off to go faster. And so but you have to be explicit, because sometimes if you just say on time, under budget, they think you're giving them permission to break the rules because you didn't say, and oh, by the way, you can't break the rules. And so you have to continually, we talk a lot about ethics, compliance. Some of the stuff we're doing around sustainability as well. We have the same wastewater treatment standard everywhere in the world, no matter what the law says. So we apply the strictest limit. We have the same workplace safety standard all over the world, measure accident rates in the exact same way, drive the same safety culture. So even if the law says something different, we want to make sure that nobody goes home with an injury. And so you're doing it in a lot of different ways around product quality, around workplace safety, around environmental issues, around all the financial reporting issues, and then in how we talk about the business and meet with the local teams. And you still have issues. We had an issue in our Korean operation a couple of years ago where somebody did something that was inappropriate. It wasn't a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act kind of thing, but it was something that they shouldn't have done. So part of the remediation plan was we had that team in doing the investigation then lead the training for the rest of the region to talk about what they had learned and what their experience had been and what mistakes were made. And we used them as the kind of the learning example and did it in a way that was culturally relevant, but drove the point home that that's not how we operate. And so that is a big, big deal. And I tell our teams all the time, it's taken us 140 years to earn a reputation as an ethical company, and you can lose it like that if you slip up. Other questions?
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you.